Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Great.
We can hear you great. Thank you.
Sure. So thank you for the introduction. I am hearing a little bit of an echo. Does anyone else hear that?
Sounds okay.
Okay, good. So I'm, as Eric said, an endocrinologist, and I've been working at Advent Health in just general endocrinology clinics. I worked for about 3.5 years in Calhoun. Sorry, I'm just hearing an echo. I'm going to try to adjust the sound here. And then about a year ago, I started working at a lifestyle center in Georgia, and it's called Wildwood Lifestyle Center. So I see some patients in endocrinology clinic. It's just pretty much like I used to do. And then some people come here for 11 days and they go on a plant-based diet, and I see them while they're here. And the goal is for them to reduce their blood pressure, blood sugar, and get off some medications. So that's a summary. Would you like me to go ahead with my lecture now? All right. Let me see if I can just adjust the PowerPoint. I need to get zoom out here so I can just see my PowerPoint. Sorry, I'm using 2 different computers and trying to bring up the PowerPoint on the one computer. Well, maybe I'll just use the computer I'm used to.
If you're having trouble, I can show you how to do it on one computer as well, where you can still see your notes.
Oh, really?
Uh-huh.
Okay, that would be great.
So when you go down to share screen, click the little tiny arrow on the upper right-hand part of share screen, and there's advanced sharing options. Oh, that's not it. It's when you share the screen. It's when you share the screen, there is a, oh man, I'm not going to be able to, there's a way that you can put a box just around a portion of your screen that you're going to share. And so you just put that box around the actual slide where it doesn't show your notes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I haven't done it before. Why don't I just do it without the notes?
That works too.
Okay. So I'm going to try to turn this computer off, and then we'll just use the video here. Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Okay.
Whoops. Echo.
I don't know what to do.
I have to turn the speaker and the mic off on that one.
Is it any better now?
Perfect.
All right. Sorry about that. Okay. So my topic today is on type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease, and the goal is to share some lifestyle medicines that can help these conditions. And let's see if I can advance my slide. It's not letting me advance my slide. Maybe, okay, there we go. But to start with, this is an important year in the field of endocrinology because it marks the 100-year anniversary of the discovery of insulin. Insulin is credited to Doctors Banting and Best. And you can see a picture here of Doctors Best and Dr. Williams doing some experiments on insulin up at the University of Toronto. I think we're all thankful for the advent of insulin and for the thousands of lives that have been saved because of it. But this evening, I want to talk about what we can do to better use the insulin that our pancreases are already making, or to better use the insulin that we are injecting so that we may ultimately need less insulin to keep good blood sugars. I'd like to talk about a patient I saw a few months ago. She was from Puerto Rico and she had a sister in Tennessee who wanted to sponsor this lady to come to the US for a month to learn about things she could do with her lifestyle to lower her blood sugars. So this lady had had type 2 diabetes for 25 years. She had been on a couple of non-insulin medications, metformin, and then she took a non-insulin injectable, I think it was Victoza, but it was thought that insulin was really the best treatment, the safest treatment for her. So 4 years before I saw her, she was switched to insulin, and she was taking about 70 units. She was taking the NPH insulin, Humulin N, 45 units in the morning, 25 in the evening. And she wasn't checking her blood sugars very often. I think I had 3 blood sugar readings from the prior 2 weeks, but her readings were ranging from anywhere from 103 to 192. Now, you may know that the American Diabetes Association recommends that persons under the age of 65 have pre-meal blood sugars in the 80 to 130 range. So her blood sugars were ranging high at times. She also had been diagnosed with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and had subsequently developed cirrhosis. She had buildup of ammonia in her blood due to the cirrhosis, and this caused some confusion, termed hepatic encephalopathy. And for that, she was taking lactulose, a liquid medication, 20 milliliters 3 times daily. Her body mass index, which was a measure of the appropriateness of her weight for her height, was 27.2, and so that's above the normal range. It put her kind of in the middle of the overweight category. So just to think about physiology for a minute here, the pancreas is an organ in our abdomen that has both an exocrine and an endocrine function. So the exocrine function involves 95% of the pancreas, more than 95% of our pancreases make digestive enzymes, which help break down our food. And less than 5% of our pancreas, and according to some estimates, about 1%, is comprised of the endocrine cells. And these cells are clustered in islets, which are comprised of around 2,000 cells. Islet cells come in different varieties. They're alpha cells that make glucagon, they're beta cells that make insulin. Both of these hormones help to regulate blood sugars, but we're going to focus mostly on insulin today. When insulin travels through the blood and reaches the pancreas, it has the effect of decreasing when insulin reaches the liver, it has the effect of decreasing the liver's output of glucose. And it does this through a few ways. It decreases the breakdown of glycogen, which is a stored form of carbohydrate, into glucose. Insulin also decreases gluconeogenesis, which is the process of making glucose out of non-carbohydrate sources. Insulin also blocks the breakdown of fat cells or adipose tissue into free fatty acids. And so the effect of insulin is to cause our body to store its energy, whether it is fat or whether it's carbohydrate stores. And of course, as a result, glucose levels in the blood fall. If we think about the molecular mechanism behind the way insulin works, we can think about a lot of different molecules. Here's a picture of what happens inside the liver cell when a person has insulin resistance. So insulin resistance often starts with an increase of fatty acid levels in our blood. So you see here by the number 1, there's a fatty acid flux. So after a high fat meal, fat levels go up in our blood, and those fatty acids make their way, some of them make their way into the liver cell, which is depicted in pink. And this causes diacylglycerol to build up in our liver cells. That forms triacylglycerol. So basically, we have fat droplets in our liver cells. Those fat droplets cause a change to occur in the inner part of the insulin receptor, that horseshoe-shaped pink structure. And when there's a lot of fat inside our liver cells, the insulin receptors reject insulin. So although we may have plenty of insulin in our blood, it is not having an effect on our liver cells. And this results ultimately in decreased glycogen synthesis. So we have decreased storage of carbohydrate, and we have increased gluconeogenesis. So we have production of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. And the net effect is increased glucose in our blood. So back to our patient. As I mentioned, she'd been diagnosed with fatty liver disease, and she'd been followed by a hepatologist, a liver specialist, who'd been doing liver scans. You can see here FibroScan reports include a steatosis score. So both in November of 2019 and May of 2020, she had a steatosis score of S3, which meant she had a high amount of liver fat. It was considered a severe level. So she was advised both times to lose weight. In fact, after her last FibroScan, the last one before I saw her, that was done in May, she was advised to lose 10% of her weight. The lady, unfortunately, was having challenges with the lifestyle change, and that's why she came here to the US for a month to try to turn over a new leaf. She was going to try doing a plant-based diet. Dr. Roy Taylor, a researcher at the University of Newcastle in England, came up with a twin cycle hypothesis. And this supposes that type 2 diabetes can be caused by increased fat in the liver. When there's increased liver fat, some of that fat is exported to the pancreas. And as fat builds up in the pancreas, the beta cell function, that is the function of the insulin producing cells, decreases. So his thought is that if a person can lose weight, if they can decrease the fat in their liver, then the fat transported to their pancreas will decrease. And ultimately, there'll be an improvement in their beta cell function. So insulin levels will go up. See if I can advance my slide. So Dr. Taylor and his team at Newcastle University started doing experiments. Their first experiments were called counterpoint. These were clinical trials where they enrolled people who had fatty liver disease. He worked with an MRI center. They did a lot of scans of abdomens of people in their studies. They were able to see how much fat was in their liver. And they included people in this study that had type 2 diabetes. So they put these people onto a low-calorie diet, and then they checked their blood sugars and they got more images. You can see in this example, someone in their study, in the counterpoint study, had 36% liver fat. So you can kind of see the liver there. It's kind of triangular shaped organ, and it looks greenish. They put these individuals on the study on a very low-calorie diet. In this case, they were consuming 600 calories for 8 weeks. At the end of the 8 weeks, this same individual had only 2% liver fat. And this was in the normal range. Also, by this time, their diabetes had gone away. So it looked like the twin cycle hypothesis worked. Dr. Taylor's team also was interested in the size of the pancreas. As you'll recall, they were doing a lot of imaging studies. So they found that the pancreas actually did change in its size and appearance. You can see in this diagram, the pancreas is an organ in the middle of the abdomen, and on the left, it looks solid. On the right, it looks kind of like a sponge. So pancreas among individuals with type 2 diabetes in Dr. Taylor's studies were 25% smaller than the pancreases of those who did not have diabetes. So they wanted to see what would happen when people went on to these low-calorie diets after they lost the weight. They were then reintroduced to their regular foods, and the goal was to keep the weight off, of course. So they were on low-calorie diets. Now I'm going to switch to another study. He did a subsequent study, which involved a lot more people. It was called the DIRECT trial. It involved about 300 participants. And so they were on a low-calorie diet, around 850 calories for a number, it was about a month, and then they were reintroduced to the regular foods over a couple months to 5 months, and then they were kept on regular foods, but they were given a lot of support for maintaining the weight loss. So in this study, you can see that individual with type 2 diabetes here had the picture of a pancreas on the far left that again looked like a sponge. Lots of shrunken areas that looked like they had holes. 5 months into this study, when people had lost the weight, were starting to keep it off, the pancreas looked more solid. And if you look at the second to the rightmost image, this is the same individual with the pancreas at 24 months into the study. The pancreas looks almost like the pancreas on the far right, which is the pancreas of someone without diabetes. So the pancreas could return to normal size with weight loss. So they also wanted to look at what happened to blood insulin levels. We knew that pancreas changed in size. What happened to pancreatic function? This diagram shows insulin levels in persons after eating breakfast. In the top tracing, you can see the insulin levels after people eat. The arrow indicates the point at which a person consumes breakfast or starts to consume breakfast. And then you see the tracing for another person beginning with the next arrow. So insulin rises very steeply in normal individuals when they eat, and then it starts to fall off over time. If you look at the bottom tracings for the diabetic individuals, we don't see a sharp rise in insulin at the start of breakfast. It takes a while for insulin to rise, and it doesn't rise. Insulin levels do not rise as high. So these are tracings of insulin levels in persons who went through Dr. Taylor's studies. Here we see in the top middle, the insulin levels of someone after eating. This was before they went through any lifestyle intervention, before they lost any weight. You can see again, insulin doesn't rise very quickly here at time 0. It rises a little bit. And then at 8 weeks into the study, so this is really just 2 months after they have started losing weight, insulin rises pretty sharply after they start eating, and then it falls. And if you compare that tracing to the tracing of someone who hasn't had diabetes, the appearance is very similar. You have a very similar initial rise in insulin, and that's called the first phase insulin response. So it was very encouraging to see that pancreatic function could return to normal with weight loss and with keeping it off. And these are really the 1 and 2 year results of the bigger trial on persons with diabetes. So this trial involved, as I mentioned, 300 individuals, and these were people from primary care clinics in England. So they weren't going to a big weight loss center. They were seeing their usual doctor, but they were getting special assistance in weight loss and weight management. And you can see that at 2 years, people who lost at least 10 kilograms, which is about 22 pounds, and kept it off for 2 years, 64% of them were in remission. So about 2/3 stayed in remission with a 22-pound weight loss maintenance at 2 years. So the majority of people in his study could reverse diabetes, and they could remain in remission. So that brings up the concept that type 2 diabetes goes hand in hand with overweight and obesity. And indeed, if we look at the body mass index of persons and their risk of developing diabetes, we see that body mass index does directly affect risk. So this is looking at people who were studied over a long period of time in the US. They looked at their body mass index and then they followed them over time to see if they would get type 2 diabetes. And you see that when body mass indexes were in the normal range, meaning they were, under 25, risk of developing type 2 diabetes was fairly low, under 10%. When body mass indexes entered the overweight category, 25 to about 29, risk started to go up for both men and women, but risk really sharply increased when BMIs went over 30. So we see that definitely weight has an impact on risk, but this figure actually shows us the body mass indexes of people in England who were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So these were the BMIs that people had at diagnosis. This was back in the 1970s to early 1990s. And you can see that while most of the individuals, and you can just imagine the area under this blue line being made up of individuals with their BMIs. So you can see that most of the individuals in this study would fall to the right of this BMI of 25. So most people were overweight or obese when they were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, but not everyone was. Over a third of persons in England had a normal body weight when they were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So this has led Dr. Taylor to consider a personal fat threshold. As we know, over time, BMIs have increased. The average BMI in the US has increased as obesity has become more widespread. So if we think about individuals in England, think about their BMIs, say 40 years ago, on average, BMIs would have been lower. So you can visualize where people are at now with their BMIs in the top curve with the red circles. And then if you look at the lower graph, the middle graph there, you can think of where they likely would have been 30 years ago, 30 years before they were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And so this leads to this concept of a personal fat threshold. So for the individual here on the left, crossing a BMI of about 21 could lead them to develop type 2 diabetes. Whereas for the individual in the middle top, once they cross a BMI of about 29, they will develop type 2 diabetes. And for the individual on the far right, a BMI of 37 is their personal fat threshold. So they need to achieve that. They need to cross that before they develop type 2 diabetes. So everyone has a different risk in terms of weight. So what can we do about this? Can we rewind the clock? Well, maybe we could, at least from a weight standpoint, go back to where we were at a few years ago. And I think that brings up the concept of a plant-based diet. Certainly, Dr. Taylor got excellent results when his participants went on a very low-calorie diet. A very low-calorie diet, though, is not what Dr. Taylor recommends long-term, and it's not what most doctors would recommend. It's not what I recommend to my patients because it's really not sustainable long-term. But there are other ways to lose weight and to reduce risk of type 2 diabetes. So the Adventist Health Study was an epidemiologic study looking at over 50,000, actually, 60,000 men and women in the US. They were adults and they were given very detailed food frequency questionnaires. And based on their answers to those questions, they were categorized into 5 different diets. And the non-vegetarians were eating the most meat. They were also consuming dairy and eggs. The semi-vegetarians ate less meat, also some eggs and dairy. Pesco-vegetarians only got fish for their meat. They also ate the eggs and dairy. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians didn't eat any meat, but they did eat the eggs and dairy. And then the vegans ate only plants. And you can see that diabetes prevalence, that is how widespread it was in the population, went down in a stepwise pattern as diets became more plant-based. And I think that that drop in diabetes risk was related to the body mass indexes of people in these different diets. So you can also see that body mass indexes decreased in a stepwise manner as diets became more plant-based, and only the vegans on average had a normal body mass index. And these BMI numbers you see are the average BMIs for people on these different diets. So definitely a plant-based diet can help to prevent excess weight based on the epidemiologic studies. That way back in the 1970s, Dr. Anderson up at the University of Kentucky did some studies on lean men with type 2 diabetes. So these men did not need to lose weight. They were taking insulin and they were admitted to his hospital. He put these men on a very low-fat diet where less than 10% of their calories were coming from fat, 70% of their calories were coming from carbohydrate, and they were getting a lot of fiber. The fiber came from, of course, fruits and vegetables, but he also really emphasized oat fiber. They got a lot of oatmeal, they got oat muffins. And the goal was not weight loss here, so the men would eat extra if they needed just to maintain their weight. But even without weight loss, in the first 16 days on this diet, over half of the participants were able to stop the use of insulin. And average insulin doses decreased from, in the 20s to 11 units. And so this suggested that a low-fat plant-based diet could help reverse type 2 diabetes, even without weight loss. So you may be curious about my patient. She decided to go on a whole foods plant-based diet, and she decided to do some intermittent fasting. Part of her program was to restrict her food intake to the early part of the day. So she ate breakfast and lunch, but she skipped suppers. She had about a 17-hour overnight fast. She also really wanted to do alternate day fast. So she wanted to fast one day a week, and she chose to do a water fast on Saturdays. I was honestly a little bit concerned that she would get enough protein, but she was confident that she wanted to try this water fasting. And she was very faithful with her exercise. She would walk after her meals, and she did at least 10,000 steps per day. She, as you will recall, was not checking her blood sugars very often. Her skin was dry, she had sore fingers, and so she suggested that we try continuous glucose monitor. She got the Freestyle Libre 2. You can see a picture there. So she had the sensor on her arm. She was able to wave the reader over that and see her glucose levels. And the great thing was that it was really affordable, even for someone without insurance. It was like $60 a month with a coupon. So it was well worth it for her because she didn't have to prick her fingers. So over the approximate 3 weeks that she was my patient, her body mass index did come down. It was still in the overweight range when she left, but it had dropped significantly. The American Diabetes Association's 2021 recommendations for managing blood sugars through weight loss are that a person lose 5 to 10% of their weight. So she had lost over 5% of her weight. She still had a little ways to go to reach the 10% that her liver doctor wanted her to achieve, but she was well on her way. And her ammonia levels dropped. She had elevated ammonia when she came, but over time, they dropped well into the normal range, and her lactulose dose decreased. Liver tests came down a little bit. AST came down, ALT just slightly. But her lactulose dose reduced by 2/3. So that was also exciting. And you can see here her blood glucose levels fasting initially were in the upper half of the hundreds range, but by the end they were in the lower half of the hundreds. Also, they dropped before lunch, they dropped before bedtime. She had an outlier there with a high reading at bedtime, but for the most part, her blood sugars were much lower. And she was able to decrease her insulin usage by 64%. For those of you using continuous glucose monitors, you may know that the target range is 70 to 180, and that the goal is to have at least 70% of your glucose readings within that range. So you want to spend 17 of the 24 hours in that target range. And if you're there at least 70 or more percent, you're at decreased risk for the diabetic eye disease, nerve disease, kidney disease. And you definitely want to spend less than an hour in the hypoglycemic range with glucose under 70. So this individual within the last week, for the last week that she was my patient, had 77% of her glucose values in the target range. So she was really at goal. This is just a tracing of the actual continuous glucose report on another patient. This individual actually had type 1 diabetes, and he liked to do intermittent fasting for religious reasons. So you can see what happened with his blood sugars here on December 8 in the bottom tracing. He took long-acting insulin around 7 in the morning. His blood sugars were kind of high at midnight. They came down over time. Then he took some short-acting insulin, and on December 9, then he did a water fast. He had taken some very long-acting insulin on December 8, so we actually didn't need to take any insulin on December 9. And you can see his blood sugars were completely in the target range for that 24 hours of his water fast. So I think I just show this to say that intermittent fasting is safe for a lot of individuals. It can be safe even for persons with type 1 diabetes. Now, I would recommend that if you're changing your meal patterns, even from eating 3 meals a day to 2 meals a day, that you talk with your doctor. If you're taking blood sugar lowering medications, those medication doses will need to be adjusted, most likely. Also, if you're taking other medications, your doctor may need to adjust the doses when you do a fast. But with proper medication adjustment, intermittent fasting can be safe and really effective. So this patient also was combining prayer with fasting on the Saturdays, and she found answers for dealing with some relationship questions came to her, especially on those days when she was praying and fasting. And she was going back to a situation where there'd been a lot of natural disasters in recent months, and there was some economic distress, but she was confident that God could guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead, and she knew that God was bigger than any problem she would face. So she was definitely feeling ready to go home at the end of the month. So in summary, type 2 diabetes is caused by excess fat in the liver and in the pancreas. A whole foods plant-based diet reduces insulin resistance through weight loss. It tends to induce weight loss, but also through non-weight loss mediated effects. And we know that based on the study from the University of Kentucky from that hospital ward. Intermittent fasting includes early time restricted feeding, where a person just eats their calories in a more narrow time window early in the day, and also alternate day fasting, where a person may go for a 24-hour period fasting. Both of those can be well tolerated, and they're a way to augment the weight loss effects of a whole foods plant-based diet. Continuous glucose monitoring is useful, it's affordable, definitely helpful, I think, when a person is changing their diets, when they're changing their insulin regimens, provides great feedback. And fasting can have spiritual benefit, as for my patient. And finally, some cases of type 2 diabetes may not reverse. So my patient did not get off insulin entirely by the end of her month here. But as you may recall, she'd had diabetes for 25 years. Now, the patients in the studies at Newcastle University had had type 2 diabetes for under 6 years, and they had not been on insulin. So my patient had had diabetes a lot longer, and she'd been on insulin. But with further weight loss, she may eventually reverse. But in any case, she was very thankful for the ability to take less insulin. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you for that exceptionally good lecture, Dr. Inancourt. If anyone has questions, feel free to jump in. I'm going to ask a question. is there any test or any way that someone can kind of be able to predict whether or not they will be able to completely get off insulin or other medications if they are committed to making some lifestyle changes? Are there tests that can predict that?
Yeah, great question. There are. C-peptide level is helpful. I think especially for people who are taking insulin, C-peptide is a part of the pre-insulin molecule. So C-peptide is made when insulin is made, and your doctor can order a test to measure it when you're fasting. They can get a blood sugar level at the same time. So if your C-peptide is normal, that indicates you are making a good amount of insulin. If it's high, it suggests you're making extra insulin. And whether or not you're taking insulin injections, you can get a good sense of your insulin production through C-peptide. C-peptide is not affected by your insulin injections.
Good.
Yeah, that gives you a sense of beta cell function.
Well, I was just fascinated by those imaging studies you shared. I see patients all the time because I look at a lot of CT scans, and I look at the pancreas, and it's just all replaced with fat. And I never thought about it until just now that that's a marker for cirrhosis of the liver, and that's a marker for diabetes. Um, and it just suddenly struck me. Yeah, I've seen patients with that all the time, but I'd never put those two things together. So that was very helpful. Anyone else have questions for Dr. Inencourt? Feel free to either unmute yourself and just ask your question, or if you want to put it in the chat, I can read it for you, whichever is easier for you. So great silence. Perhaps, Aisha, you could tell us a little bit about the program that you're going to be running starting here in June.
Sure. So Rewind Diabetes is a lifestyle program for improving insulin resistance, reducing insulin resistance. I think it's for anyone with prediabetes, for people with type 2 diabetes, even people with type 1 diabetes could follow these principles and reduce their insulin needs. We go over whole foods, plant-based diets, the reasons behind those, how to start them. There's a recipe each session. There's an exercise component. So we also talk about how exercise helps to lower insulin needs, and we make recommendations about how you can start an exercise program. And I talk a little bit about sleep and its effect on insulin resistance. So we talk about a lot of the things that we touched on tonight, but just in greater detail.
Good. And I think that the excellent thing about these more weekly programs is not only the information, because at some point, although I seem to learn something new every single time, there is a point at which it's not really the information that's the limiting factor. The limiting factor seems to be motivation and being accountable to friends, colleagues, partners, to actually make the changes that we know we should be making. So that's what I think this diabetes program will especially be helpful for. We'll have some small group discussions and things of that nature as well. And for those of you who have more personal questions, you might want to talk with Dr. Inencourt. I'm sure there'll be an opportunity for that as well. Let me share my screen just once more for those of you who came in a little bit later here. If you wish to register for the diabetes program, go to southbaysda.org, and then you go up here to the health tab, and under upcoming programs, there's lots of great upcoming programs. Of course, right now we're on Dinner with the Doctor, and you can register for that. You can also see a lot of the recipes. Right now, the dinner is one you have to make yourself. Hopefully, we'll be able to get back to meeting in person here sometime soon. There is a cooking class, as I mentioned, that you can register for and get the information about the Zoom link there. The cooking class is actually starting this next Thursday. So this is going to be an excellent class with Rachel Detweiler, and I believe she has some other cooks that are going to be helping her. The class that Dr. Aisha Inencourt will be leading is the Diabetes Rewind class. That's starting June 10. And again, it's free, but you do need to register. If you'd like more information about that class, there's lots more information there for you to kind of read over. but I do think that this is something that's going to be very, very helpful for many people. So if you or someone you love, someone you know, someone you dislike, doesn't matter, if there's someone in your life that needs to learn about diabetes, this is an exceptionally good way to help with diabetes. Well, thank you so much for all of those of you who came out, and especially thank you, Dr. Inker, for your time this evening. I know you're very busy. She told me she was going to be seeing patients probably right up till when we started here, so I'm just thankful that she was able to find some time to share with us. Any last minute questions? See, some of you unmuted yourselves, so just wanted to give you an opportunity if you had any questions. All right.
Thank you for all the information.
Yeah, it's a lot of good information there, isn't it? Well,
Yes,
let's
indeed.
bow our heads for prayer and excuse me. And remember, you can always send questions between times to dwtdhickson@gmail.com. I do check that email address at least once a week. And if you have not yet signed up to receive emails, please go to dwtdhickson.com and register for our email list. I think most of you probably got the link that way. But in any case, we want to be able to share the blessings of health with as many people as possible. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Dear God, we're just so thankful for the ways that you lead and guide. We are thankful for the blessing of health. We know that you want us to prosper and be in health just as our souls prosper. I ask that you will bless each participant here. Help us to be able to manage our diet, our lifestyle, exercise, and all the other components of health correctly so that we don't get that buildup of fat in our liver or the buildup of fat in our pancreas or that overabundance of calories that leads to so many different problems. Bless Dr. Inencourt and her practice in Wildwood, Georgia. I ask that you will be with her as she's seeing patients, give her wisdom, and we're just thankful for her expertise and willingness to share, and look forward to the diabetes program coming up. Bless each one of us now, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Good night. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Enjoyed it. Thank you. Got a lot of information. Thank you.
Li Hua, it's great to see you, and Chao Ming, Indu, and Renee. It is so good to have you back in Chattanooga.
Yeah.
I went over and saw Indu here a couple days ago. They've moved back, so we're thankful they're back here in Chattanooga.
Right.
As soon as we have our health education facility built, we need to have a good Indian meal again. What do y'all think?
Yeah. Sounds great.
Yeah. So,
Looking forward to that. Yeah.
Thank you again.
And the building, when will the building be finished?
probably about 10 months from now.
Oh, okay. Sometime next month, next year.
Yep,
Right.
early next year sometime.
Yeah.
So we're
Okay.
looking forward to that. Really are. Well, good night, all. Make sure you get a good night, and we will see you hopefully on Thursday night at the cooking school, and then 3 Thursdays from then, see Dr. Inencourt again for the diabetes program.
Thank you again. Thank you so much. And good to
Bye-bye.
see you.
Good night.
Good night.